I spent decades giving everything to my family, only to be cast aside on the most important day of my life. But what I discovered after that heartbreak changed everything I thought I knew about love, respect, and myself. My name is Margaret Hale, and I am 65 years old, and for most of my life I believed that being a good mother meant giving until there was nothing left of me. I believed love was proven through sacrifice, through silence, through paying the bill even when it hurt, through smiling even when your heart was cracking. I raised my son alone after his father left early, and from the moment I held that tiny body against my chest, I promised myself that he would never feel abandoned or unsupported the way I once did. I worked long hours, skipped vacation, wore the same coats year after year, and quietly put my dreams on a shelf because his needs always came first. When he grew up and announced he was getting married, I felt pride and fear wrapped together. Pride because I thought I had raised a kind and responsible man. Fear because some part of me sensed that this chapter might cost me more than money. I brushed that feeling aside and told myself this was what mothers did. They showed up. They helped. They celebrated their children even when it stretched them thin. I offered to contribute to the wedding without being asked. I paid deposits, covered outfit, helped with decoration, and when costs grew higher than expected, I told myself it was only money and money could be earned again. What I did not realize was that I was not just paying for a wedding, I was paying for my own erasure. As the plans moved forward, my voice grew smaller. Suggestions were ignored. Questions were met with impatience. I noticed the way his future family looked through me rather than at me, as if I were a walking wallet rather than a human being. Still, I stayed quiet because I did not want to cause tension. I told myself that once the wedding day came, all of this stress would melt away and we would laugh about it later. On the morning of the ceremony, I woke up early, nervous but hopeful, standing in front of the mirror trying to calm my hands. I had chosen my dress carefully, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention, just something that made me feel presentable and proud. Before I could leave, my phone rang. It was my son. His voice sounded tight and unfamiliar. He told me there had been a discussion and that it would be better if I did not attend the ceremony. He said it would make things easier. He said his in-laws felt uncomfortable and that my presence might disrupt the atmosphere they wanted. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, the room suddenly too quiet, my ears ringing as if I had been struck. I asked him if he was serious. He said yes. He told me he hoped I would understand. Understand. That word echoed inside me like a cruel joke. I had paid for a celebration I was no longer welcome to witness. I had poured years of love into a son who was now asking me to disappear for his convenience. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply said okay because that is what I had always done. I stayed home that day, dressed in clothes that were never meant to see the light, watching the hours pass, with a hollow feeling I cannot fully describe. Later that evening, messages came in, not apologies, but requests. There were additional expenses, last-minute costs, things that needed to be handled, as if nothing had happened, as if I were still expected to fund a moment I had been excluded from. Something inside me shifted then, quietly but permanently. It was not anger at first. It was clarity. I realized that love without boundaries had taught people how to use me. I realized that being a good mother did not mean accepting humiliation. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to feel the pain fully without rushing to fix it. I cried, not just for that day, but for every moment I had made myself small to keep the peace. And in that silence, sitting alone with my grief, a question formed that would change everything. What if I chose myself now? The days after the wedding passed in a strange blur, quiet on the outside and thunderous inside my chest, because once the ceremony was over the requests did not stop, they intensified, invoices forwarded to me with casual notes attached, reminders about payments as if exclusion were a small misunderstanding rather than a deliberate choice, and each message landed heavier than the last. I remember staring at my phone, reading the same lines over and over, wondering how my role had been reduced to numbers and deadlines, how easily love had been translated into obligation. I had always believed that motherhood was unconditional, but I had never asked myself whether it should be unprotected. Late one evening, as I sat at my kitchen table with papers spread out before me, receipts and bank statements showing years of careful saving slowly drained away, I felt something unfamiliar rise up in me. It was not rage, and it was not bitterness. It was resolve. I realized that continuing to pay would not restore my dignity or heal the wound. It would only confirm the lesson that my absence did not matter as long as my money showed up on time. I decided to stop responding for a day, just one day, to breathe and think. That silence felt terrifying at first, like stepping off a ledge without knowing whether there was ground beneath my feet. But something surprising happened. The world did not end. The guilt I expected to crush me did not arrive. Instead, I felt a strange sense of space, as if I had been holding my breath for decades and had finally exhaled. When I did respond, my words were calm and simple. I said I would not be sending any more money. I said I needed time and distance to process what had happened. I did not accuse or explain. I simply stated a boundary. The reaction was immediate and sharp. My son called, his voice filled with frustration, telling me I was being unfair, that I was putting him in a difficult position, that I was embarrassing him. I listened quietly, my hands steady, my heart pounding but no longer collapsing. I told him I loved him, but I would not accept being treated as disposable. I told him that being his mother did not mean surrendering my self-respect. There was a long pause on the line, followed by words that confirmed everything I needed to know. He said this was what everyone else wanted and that I should just go along with it. In that moment, the final thread snapped. I understood that I had been negotiating my worth with people who benefited from my silence. After that call, the financial demands became more aggressive. Messages carried an edge. I was reminded of past help as if it were a contract. I was told I was selfish. I was told I was ruining relationships. Each accusation hurt, but it also strengthened my clarity. I began documenting everything, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. I organized records, noted dates, and protected myself in ways I never had before. For years, I had believed love meant trust without limits. Now I learned that wisdom meant accountability. As weeks passed, the noise slowly faded. When no more money came, the calls lessened, the urgency dissolved. And with that quiet, I discovered something else. I discovered myself. I woke up earlier, walked longer, cooked meals just for my own enjoyment, and sat with my thoughts without rushing to bury them. I began to grieve, not just the loss of a moment, but the loss of an illusion. I had imagined a future where my son would one day look back and appreciate my sacrifices. Letting go of that expectation was painful, but also freeing. I realized that my value did not depend on recognition. It depended on how I treated myself when no one else was watching. Slowly, my shame turned into strength. I stopped replaying the wedding day in my mind and started focusing on the days ahead. I learned that boundaries are not punishment. They are invitations to healthier relationships, and when those invitations are rejected, it reveals truths we can no longer ignore. I did not cut my son out of my heart, but I removed him from control over my life. That distinction saved me. For the first time, I felt aligned with my own voice. I was no longer the woman who paid to be tolerated. I was a woman who chose dignity, even when it cost her comfort. As the months passed, the quiet I had feared began to feel like healing rather than loss, and I started to understand how much noise I had mistaken for love all those years. Without constant demands pulling at me, I noticed how my days slowly reshaped themselves, softer mornings, steadier evenings, and a sense of ownership over my time that felt almost foreign. I began to look back over my life with clearer eyes, not to blame myself, but to finally tell myself the truth. I saw how often I had chosen peace over honesty, how frequently I had swallowed discomfort to keep others comfortable, and how deeply I had confused endurance with virtue. Motherhood had been the center of my identity for so long that when my role was rejected, I felt temporarily erased. But in that erasure, I found room to rebuild. I started journaling at night, writing down memories I had never allowed myself to question, moments when I had been overlooked, dismissed, or gently pushed aside, always told it was for the greater good. Seeing those patterns on paper was sobering, but it was also empowering. I was no longer trapped inside them. I was observing them from a distance, and that distance gave me perspective. Occasionally, my son would reach out with short messages, polite but guarded, as if unsure of where I now stood. I responded kindly but without bending. I did not offer money. I did not apologize for protecting myself. I let the conversations be what they were, not what I wished they could be. That restraint was one of the hardest lessons of my life. I had spent decades rushing in to fix, to soothe, to rescue. Learning to step back felt unnatural, like using muscles I had never developed, yet each time I held my boundary, I felt stronger. I also noticed how my body responded to this change. The tightness in my chest eased. I slept through the night more often. I laughed more freely, even when I was alone. I reconnected with old interests, small things that once brought me joy, reading late into the night, cooking slowly without rushing, listening to music that reminded me of who I was before I became everything for everyone else. People around me noticed the change too. They said I seemed lighter, more grounded. What they did not see was the grief I still carried, the quiet sadness of accepting that love does not always grow in the ways we expect. I grieved the fantasy of reconciliation without accountability, the hope that one heartfelt conversation could undo years of imbalance. Accepting reality did not make me cold. It made me honest. I realized that forgiveness does not require self-betrayal, and compassion does not mean compliance. I could love my son and still refuse to finance my own disrespect. That distinction became my anchor. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, I found a photo of myself from years ago, younger, smiling brightly, eyes full of promise. I stared at it for a long time and felt a rush of tenderness for the woman I had been, the woman who tried so hard to do everything right. I whispered to her that she did the best she could with what she knew, and that now it was time for her to rest. That moment felt like a closing circle. I stopped measuring my worth by my usefulness to others and started measuring it by my integrity. I learned that freedom does not arrive all at once. It comes in quiet choices, in the courage to disappoint people who benefit from your silence, in the willingness to sit with discomfort rather than erase yourself to avoid it. There are still days when the ache returns unexpectedly, triggered by a memory or a question that never gets answered. On those days, I remind myself why I chose this path. I chose it because dignity matters. I chose it because love should never require invisibility. I chose it because at 65 years old, I deserve a life shaped by respect, including the respect I show myself. This story is not about punishment or revenge. It is about awakening. It is about a woman who finally listened to her own voice after years of ignoring it. I did not lose my family that day. I found myself. And that discovery, though painful, gave me a future that belongs to me. With time, the shock of what happened softened into something quieter and more complex, and I began to understand that healing is not a straight line, but a series of small reckonings you face when no one is watching. I stopped waiting for an apology that might never come and focused instead on repairing the trust I had broken myself. That was the hardest truth to accept, that long before anyone else crossed a line, I had been stepping over my own needs again and again. I started asking myself simple questions throughout the day. What do I want right now? What feels right to me? What am I avoiding because it might upset someone else? These questions felt almost rebellious at first, as if I were doing something wrong by considering myself. Slowly, they became grounding. I noticed how often I had lived on edge, anticipating requests before they were spoken, planning my responses around other people's comfort. Letting go of that habit felt like learning a new language. There were moments of doubt when I wondered if I had been too harsh, if standing firm had made me less loving. Those moments usually came late at night, when the house was still and my thoughts grew louder. But each time I traced the timeline honestly, I returned to the same conclusion. Respect cannot exist where fear of disapproval controls your choices. I began to see my past generosity more clearly, not as a flaw, but as a strength that had been misdirected. My capacity to give was real and beautiful. What needed to change was who had access to it. That realization shifted something deep inside me. I no longer felt ashamed of my kindness. I felt protective of it. I also learned that independence is not isolation. I allowed myself to accept support from people who offered it freely, without strings or expectation. Conversations felt lighter when they were not transactional. Laughter felt fuller when it was not followed by obligation. I rebuilt my routines intentionally. Mornings that began with quiet reflection instead of urgency. Evenings that ended with gratitude instead of exhaustion. The more stable I felt within myself, the less power the past held over me. My son remained a presence in my thoughts, but no longer the axis around which everything turned. I released the belief that I could fix his choices or soften their consequences. That responsibility was never mine to carry. One day, unexpectedly, I received a message from him that was different in tone, less demanding, more uncertain. He asked how I was. The simplicity of the question moved me more than I expected. I answered honestly but carefully, without reopening old wounds or offering more than I could give. It felt like standing on solid ground instead of shifting sand. Whether that moment would grow into something deeper, I did not know, and for the first time, I accepted that I did not need to know. I had learned that peace comes from clarity, not control. Looking back, I see that the wedding was not the ending I once thought it was. It was a beginning disguised as a loss. It forced me to confront patterns I had inherited and repeated without question. It taught me that love does not require self-sacrifice to the point of disappearance. It reminded me that age does not limit growth, and that awakening can happen at any stage of life. At 65, I am still learning, still unlearning, still becoming. I move forward with a steadier heart now, one that honors both compassion and boundary. I no longer measure success by how much I give away, but by how fully I live in alignment with my values. There is strength in choosing yourself, not as an act of defiance, but as an act of truth. I carry that truth with me every day, quiet and unwavering, a reminder that my life is still mine to shape, and that freedom, once claimed, becomes a responsibility to yourself above all else. By the time another year turned over, I realized that the woman I had become no longer fit inside the old rules I once lived by, and instead of mourning that, I felt quietly proud of it. I no longer woke up bracing myself for disappointment or rehearsing explanations for choices that needed no defense. My days felt intentional, shaped by my own rhythm rather than someone else's urgency. I learned how deeply exhaustion had lived in me before, the kind that sleep does not cure because it comes from emotional overextension. As that weight lifted, I noticed how much clearer my thinking became. I could sit with difficult emotions without being consumed by them. I could feel sadness without collapsing, and joy without suspicion. I stopped telling myself stories about what I owed people based on history alone. I started asking what was healthy now. That shift changed everything. My relationship with money transformed as well. What once felt like a tool for proving love became something I managed with respect and foresight. I created plans that honored my future, not someone else's expectation. Each careful decision felt like an act of self-trust, something I had rarely practiced before. I also reflected on how silence had shaped my past, how often I had avoided hard conversations in the name of harmony. I understood now that unspoken resentment does not preserve peace. It only delays honesty. When I spoke now, I chose my words carefully but firmly. I did not soften truths to make them easier to swallow. I trusted others to manage their reaction. That was not cruelty, it was maturity. Occasionally, guilt still tried to return, dressed in familiar thoughts about obligation and motherhood. When it did, I met it with compassion rather than fear. I reminded myself that love rooted in fear is not love at all. It is survival. I had survived long enough. I was ready to live. I noticed how my presence changed in rooms, how I took up space without apology, how I listened more deeply, because I was no longer waiting to be needed. There was a calm authority in that, one I had never known before. My son and I remained connected at a distance that felt respectful rather than painful. I no longer chased closeness or withheld affection as leverage. I let the relationship breathe. Whatever shape it took would have to be built on mutual regard, not sacrifice alone. Accepting that uncertainty was another form of freedom. I learned that strength does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it looks like consistency, like saying no without anger, like choosing rest without justification. The world did not punish me for stepping back the way I once feared it would. In fact, it responded with unexpected ease. Opportunities appeared, friendships deepened. I found myself curious about the future in a way that felt hopeful rather than anxious. I allowed myself to imagine years ahead filled with meaning, learning, and connection that did not depend on approval. I had spent so much of my life defining myself through roles that I had forgotten I was a person first. Reclaiming that truth felt revolutionary. When I look back now, I do not see a woman who is betrayed and broken. I see a woman who is tested and awakened. I see courage in the moment she chose to stop paying for her own pain. I see wisdom in the patience that followed. I see grace in the way she learned to love without losing herself. This chapter of my life has taught me that freedom is not something granted by others. It is something you claim quietly through decisions that align with your deepest values. At 65, I stand rooted in that understanding. I know who I am. I know what I deserve. And I know that my story is far from over. There came a point when I stopped revisiting the past as a place of injury and began seeing it as a teacher that no longer needed to shout to be heard. I noticed how my memories softened around the edges, no longer sharp enough to wound, but clear enough to remind me who I had been and who I had chosen to become. I began trusting my instincts again, the quiet signals I had ignored for years in favor of being agreeable. Now, when something felt wrong, I paused instead of pushing through it. That pause became sacred space. It gave me time to respond rather than react, to choose rather than comply. I also became more honest with myself about the cost of my old patterns. I saw how often I had confused loyalty with self-abandonment, how easily I had equated love with endurance. Letting go of those beliefs felt like setting down a heavy bag I had been carrying without realizing how much it weighed. I started filling my days with things that reflected my inner life rather than distracted me from it. Long walks turned into conversations with myself. Silence became comforting instead of lonely. I allowed emotions to pass through me without labeling them as problems to solve. This gentler way of living brought clarity I had never known. When challenges arose, I met them with steadiness instead of panic. I trusted my ability to navigate discomfort without dissolving into guilt. My son remained part of my story, but no longer its author. When we spoke, I listened without trying to steer the outcome. I shared my thoughts without editing them to sound more acceptable. That honesty created a new dynamic, unfamiliar but real. Sometimes it felt awkward, sometimes distant, but it was grounded in truth. I accepted that love can exist alongside disappointment, and that maturity often looks like holding both without forcing resolution. I also noticed how my sense of identity expanded beyond motherhood. I explored interests I had postponed, ideas I had dismissed as impractical. I allowed myself to be curious again. That curiosity reawakened a sense of aliveness I thought had faded with time. I felt engaged with the world rather than bracing against it. People responded to that energy. Conversations felt richer. Connections felt more balanced. I was no longer showing up to earn my place. I was showing up as myself. There were moments when fear whispered that this new confidence might make me unlovable, that standing firm could cost me relationships. Each time that thought appeared, I examined it closely and found it rooted in an old belief that my value depended on usefulness. I gently released that belief and replaced it with a truer one. My value is inherent. It does not increase when I give more than I have, and it does not disappear when I say no. This understanding settled into me slowly, becoming part of how I moved through the world. I stopped explaining myself unnecessarily. I stopped apologizing for having limits. I stopped shrinking to make room for others. None of this made me less kind. It made my kindness honest. As I look ahead now, I feel grounded in a way that once felt impossible. I do not know exactly what the future holds, but I trust myself to meet it with integrity. I have learned that strength is not found in sacrifice alone, but in balance, in knowing when to give and when to protect. My life feels fuller, not because it is louder, but because it is truer. This chapter continues to unfold quietly, shaped by intention rather than obligation. And with each passing day, I feel more at home in myself, confident that the woman I am now is someone I can stand behind, someone worthy of respect, including my own. Somewhere along this journey, I realized that reclaiming myself was not a dramatic moment but a steady practice, one choice layered gently over another until my life began to feel like it truly belonged to me. I stopped measuring progress by how calm everything looked and started measuring it by how honest I felt inside. There were days when I still missed the version of motherhood I once imagined, the easy closeness, the shared milestones without tension. I allowed myself to feel that loss without turning it into a verdict against my decision. Grief, I learned, does not mean you chose wrong. It means you cared deeply. I also learned that longing does not require self-sacrifice to be honored. I could hold space for sadness without reopening doors that led to harm. As I grew more comfortable with this balance, my confidence deepened. I trusted my reactions more. I noticed when something felt off and no longer dismissed that feeling as oversensitivity. My intuition had been patient with me all these years, waiting for me to listen. Now that I did, it guided me quietly and well. I became more selective with my energy, choosing conversations that felt reciprocal, relationships that respected my boundaries, and commitments that aligned with my values. This selectiveness was not about closing myself off. It was about clarity. I understood that time is one of the most honest currencies we have, and I was done spending it where it was not valued. My son and I continued to navigate our relationship cautiously. Sometimes there were moments of warmth that reminded me of earlier years, moments that made my heart soften and ache at the same time. I welcomed those moments without clinging to them. I no longer built expectations on brief gestures. I let consistency speak louder than hope. That restraint protected me. It allowed me to stay open without becoming vulnerable to disappointment in the same way. I found a quiet pride in that balance. I had not hardened, I had matured. I also began speaking more openly about my experiences, not to seek validation, but to tell the truth. When people shared their own stories of feeling used or overlooked, I listened with empathy and without judgment. I recognized the familiar patterns and gently reminded them that love should not require self-erasure. These conversations felt meaningful, as if my pain had been transformed into something useful, something that could offer perspective to others without reopening my wounds. I noticed how differently I moved through the world now. I made decisions without rehearsing how to justify them. I rested without guilt. I enjoyed moments of solitude as nourishment rather than absence. Even my posture changed. I stood taller, breathed deeper, and met my reflection with a kindness I had rarely offered myself before. The woman looking back at me felt grounded and capable, shaped by experience rather than defined by it. There were still challenges, of course. Life did not become perfect because I set boundaries, but when difficulties arose, I met them with a steadiness that surprised me. I no longer collapsed inward or reached outward for rescue. I trusted myself to respond thoughtfully. That trust became my foundation. I also reflected on how aging had been framed to me for so long as a narrowing of possibility. My experience told a different story. With each year, I felt more free, more discerning, more rooted in what mattered. I had less patience for nonsense and more appreciation for sincerity. That clarity was a gift. I embraced it fully. Looking back at the woman I was before the wedding, I feel compassion rather than regret. She acted out of love, out of hope, out of a belief that giving more would create closeness. She did not fail. She learned. And the woman I am now carries that lesson forward with grace. I no longer chase approval or fear disapproval. I move with intention, guided by self-respect. This chapter of my life continues to unfold quietly, marked not by grand gesture, but by daily acts of honesty. I wake up knowing who I am and what I stand for. I fall asleep knowing I did not betray myself to make someone else comfortable. That peace, hard-won and deeply earned, is something no one can take from me. As this season of my life deepened, I began to notice how freedom changes the way you see everything, not suddenly, but subtly, like light shifting in a familiar room. Ordinary moments felt richer because I was fully present in them instead of bracing for the next demand. I paid attention to details I once rushed past: the sound of morning quiet, the comfort of a familiar chair, the satisfaction of completing something just for myself. These were not grand victories, but they carried a quiet dignity that felt deeply earned. I realized how long I had lived with a background tension, an unspoken readiness to be called upon, corrected, or needed. Letting go of that vigilance softened me in ways I did not expect. I laughed more easily. I listened more openly. I trusted my reactions instead of second-guessing them. The relationship with my son continued to evolve in small, uneven steps. Sometimes he reached out with genuine curiosity, sometimes with guarded politeness. I met him where he was without abandoning where I stood. That balance required constant awareness, but it no longer drained me. I had learned that love does not mean availability at all costs. It means honesty offered without force. I stopped trying to interpret every word or predict every outcome. I allowed space for uncertainty without filling it with fear. This acceptance felt like maturity settling into my bones. I also became more reflective about the legacy I wanted to leave behind. Not one defined by sacrifice alone, but by self-respect, clarity, and courage. I wanted to model what it looks like to choose dignity even when it is uncomfortable. I wanted my story to show that it is never too late to change the terms of your life. That intention shaped my choices moving forward. I noticed how often women my age are expected to fade quietly, to remain useful, but unseen. I refused that role. I spoke when I had something to say. I stepped back when something did not feel right. I honored my limits without apology. This was not rebellion. It was alignment. I had spent enough years living slightly off-center. Now I stood firmly in my own life. I reflected often on the idea of forgiveness, how it had been used in the past to rush me past my own pain. I understood now that forgiveness is not a transaction or a performance. It is an internal release that happens in its own time. I did not need to forgive anyone to validate my choices. I needed to remain truthful to my experience. That truth became my compass. It guided me through moments of doubt and moments of hope with equal steadiness. I found myself more patient with others, not because I tolerated mistreatment, but because I no longer took responsibility for emotions that were not mine. That distinction brought peace. It allowed me to engage with empathy without self-abandonment. As I moved through my days, I noticed how grounded I felt in my body, how my breath deepened when I trusted myself, how tension dissolved when I stopped explaining. These physical changes mirrored the emotional ones. Healing was not just something I thought about, it was something I lived. I also recognized that my story was no longer defined by what had been taken from me, but by what I had reclaimed: my time, my voice, my agency, my sense of worth. These were not small things, they were foundational. I no longer needed external validation to confirm what I already knew. I had survived disappointment without becoming bitter. I had chosen integrity over approval. I had learned to stand alone without feeling lonely. That strength felt quiet but unshakable. As I look ahead, I do not feel the urgency that once drove me. I feel readiness. Whatever comes next will meet a woman who knows herself, who values peace over performance, and who understands that her life is not measured by how much she gives away, but by how honestly she lives. This chapter continues, steady and intentional, shaped by self-respect, and sustained by the simple, powerful act of choosing myself each day. There are moments now when I catch myself smiling for no obvious reason, and those moments tell me more about my healing than any milestone ever could. They arrive quietly, unannounced, while I am folding laundry, sipping tea, or watching the light change outside my window. They are reminders that peace does not need permission to exist. I think often about how different my inner world feels compared to before, how I no longer live in anticipation of being corrected or overlooked. My thoughts move more slowly, more kindly. I give myself time to decide instead of rushing to accommodate. That patience has changed the texture of my days. I no longer feel like I am running behind my own life. I am present in it. I have also come to understand that strength is not something you prove once and then keep forever. It is something you practice repeatedly, especially when old habits try to return wearing familiar disguises. Sometimes I still feel the pull to explain myself too much, to smooth over discomfort, to offer more than is asked. When that happens, I pause and remind myself that clarity is kinder than overgiving. I choose my response with care. That pause has become one of the most powerful tools I own. It protects me from reacting out of fear and helps me respond from self-respect. My relationship with my son continues to sit in a place of cautious honesty. There are conversations that feel genuine and moments that feel distant. I no longer try to label them or force meaning where there may be none. I let the relationship exist as it is, without idealizing it or rejecting it. This neutrality feels healthy. It allows room for connection without expectation. I have learned that closeness built on pressure is not closeness at all. Real connection grows slowly, rooted in mutual regard. Whether or not that growth happens is no longer something I control, and accepting that has brought relief. I have also noticed how my perspective on the past has matured. I no longer replay events to punish myself or rewrite outcomes. Instead, I view them as chapters that shaped me without defining me. I see the younger version of myself with compassion rather than judgment. She did not know what I know now. She loved fiercely and hoped deeply. Those qualities were never weaknesses. They simply needed guidance. I am that guidance now. I also think about how society often tells women to endure quietly, to be grateful for whatever connection remains, no matter the cost. I reject that narrative. Endurance without dignity is not virtue. It is erasure. Choosing yourself is not selfish. It is necessary. This understanding has influenced how I move through every relationship in my life. I listen more carefully to how I feel during interaction. I notice whether I leave feeling nourished or diminished. That awareness helps me choose where to invest my energy. I am no longer afraid to step back when something feels wrong. I trust that instinct. I have earned it. I also allow myself joy without justification. I celebrate small wins, peaceful afternoon, meaningful conversation. I do not minimize these moments or wait for something bigger to validate them. They are enough. I am enough. That belief has settled into me with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting patiently all along. Aging has become a teacher rather than a threat. With each year, I feel less interested in proving myself and more interested in living honestly. I care less about appearances and more about alignment. This shift has simplified my life in ways I never imagined. I am lighter, not because I have less responsibility, but because I carry it differently. I no longer confuse responsibility with self-sacrifice. I understand that my well-being matters, not just to me, but to the quality of every connection I have. When I honor myself, I show up more fully for others. That balance feels right. As I continue forward, I hold my story gently, aware of its weight but no longer burdened by it. I know there may still be moments of sadness or longing. Healing does not erase those feelings. It gives them context. It teaches you how to carry them without letting them lead. I am grateful for that wisdom. I am grateful for the woman I have become through this process. Steady, reflective, and rooted in truth. My life now feels intentional rather than reactive. I wake each day grounded in the knowledge that I am allowed to choose peace. That knowledge shapes everything. It guides my decisions, informs my boundaries, and sustains my hope. This chapter continues to unfold, not with urgency, but with quiet confidence. I am no longer waiting to be chosen. I have already chosen myself. I have come to understand that true resilience is not the absence of pain, but the willingness to live fully despite it. And each day, I practice that willingness in ways both large and small. I no longer let past disappointments define how I approach the present. Instead, I allow myself to act from clarity, guided by what I know to be right for me. There are mornings when I wake with a sense of quiet anticipation, not anxiety, and I notice how different that feels from the decades I spent bracing for someone else's judgment. I move through my home with a gentleness I rarely gave myself before, noticing the way light falls across familiar surfaces, how sounds echo differently when I am present and attentive. These details, small as they are, bring a profound sense of grounding. I reflect on my son often, not with bitterness, but with understanding of our limitation. I accept that love does not always equal agreement and that closeness cannot be demanded or coerced. I let him exist as he chooses, and I exist fully as myself. That practice of separation without hostility has changed the way I relate to nearly everyone in my life. I engage more fully, listen more deeply, and respond with honesty rather than reaction. I have realized that truth is not always comfortable, but it is freeing. I have learned to sit with silence instead of filling it with explanations or apologies, and in that silence, I often find more clarity than I do in conversation. I am more aware of my boundaries and more deliberate in holding them. Saying no is no longer an act of guilt, but an affirmation of self-respect. I recognize that my time, my energy, and my peace are valuable, and I guard them without shame. The world has not punished me for this. In fact, relationships that remain are stronger because they are chosen freely and maintained with mutual regard. I also notice how my perception of happiness has shifted. It is no longer tied to external validation or approval. I find it in the rhythm of my day, the satisfaction of tasks completed with intention, the small moments of connection with people who respect me. I allow myself to savor these moments without guilt or expectation. I find joy in my own company, reading, walking, or reflecting in ways I used to consider indulgent. These acts of self-attention no longer feel selfish, they feel necessary. I have discovered a deep strength in accepting that life is unpredictable and that I cannot control every outcome. Rather than exhausting myself trying to steer every situation toward comfort, I focus on how I respond, how I maintain integrity and presence. That focus has changed my interactions with friends, neighbors, and family. I listen more and judge less. I approach conversations with curiosity rather than defensiveness. I have grown more patient, not because life is easier, but because I am steadier. The inner chaos that once dictated my reaction has quieted. I also reflect on the lessons of sacrifice I once embraced unquestioningly. I see now that giving until you have nothing left does not prove love. It proves that you were never taught to honor yourself first. Relearning that lesson has been transformative. I have begun to give generously, yes, but from a place of abundance and choice rather than compulsion. That difference has shifted how people respond to me as well. The energy I receive in return is authentic, not transactional. I have learned to recognize patterns of exploitation without carrying resentment for those who act within their limitations. This awareness has allowed me to maintain compassion without surrendering boundaries. Aging, once a source of fear, has become a teacher. Each year, I feel more capable of observing myself with honesty, more willing to confront uncomfortable truths, and more open to experiencing life in its fullness. I no longer apologize for growing, for claiming space, for prioritizing my well-being. I move with the quiet confidence of someone who has seen her own resilience and embraced it fully. There are moments of reflection when I marvel at how far I have come from the woman who sat alone on her son's wedding day, excluded and overlooked, wondering if love required erasure. That woman did the best she could with what she knew, and I honor her for it. Yet I also recognize that her story does not end in absence or shame. It continues in the choices I make now, in the steady assertion of my worth, in the freedom I have claimed. I have learned that life does not hand you clarity or peace. You cultivate them deliberately, and each day presents an opportunity to practice that cultivation anew. That understanding shapes my mornings, my evening, and the quiet moments in between. I move through the world with intention, honoring my needs, my limits, and my desires, and in doing so, I feel more fully alive than ever before. The past, with its betrayals and disappointments, no longer defines me. It informs me, yes, but it does not control me. I carry forward the lessons of endurance, self-respect, and courage, knowing that they are tools I can use for the rest of my life. In this season, I stand firmly in my own truth, aware of the power in choosing myself each day. I do not expect anyone else to validate that choice. It is enough for me to know that I honor my own voice. That voice has grown steadier with time, filled with compassion, clarity, and a quiet but unwavering strength. I have learned that reclaiming your life is not an event, it is a practice. It is the daily decision to live with honesty, to respect your own boundary, and to move through the world with integrity. That practice has given me a sense of freedom I had never known, and it has reshaped the way I see everything, including the woman I have become. I am still learning, still growing, still unearthing layers of self I did not know existed. Each day is an opportunity to step more fully into that knowledge, to live in alignment with the values I hold, and to honor the life I have worked so hard to reclaim. The journey is ongoing, but I am no longer afraid of it. I face it with steadiness, gratitude, and a profound sense of self-respect that guides every step I take. Over time, I began to notice how deeply my sense of self had been buried beneath expectations and obligations, and uncovering it was both exhilarating and frightening. I realized that for decades I had measured my worth by how much I could give, how quietly I could endure, how perfectly I could meet someone else's standard, and in that process, I had lost sight of who I truly was. Rediscovering myself required patience and courage. I had to face uncomfortable truths about my choices, the ways I had allowed others to dictate my life, and the moments I had minimized my own needs. That process was not quick. Some days, I felt like I was wading through fog, unsure of what to trust or where to step next. But slowly, clarity emerged. I began to recognize the difference between love that nourishes and love that consumes, between relationships that grow in mutual respect and those that demand self-erasure. That recognition shifted everything. I started making choices from a place of awareness rather than compulsion. I began to speak up when something felt wrong, to assert boundaries without guilt, to protect my peace without apology. These actions felt small at first, almost imperceptible, but they accumulated into a profound change in how I experienced life. I noticed how my body responded differently. I stood taller, breathed more deeply, and moved through spaces with a quiet confidence I had rarely felt before. The tension I carried for years in my shoulders and chest began to release as my mind accepted that I was no longer obligated to prove my worth through constant sacrifice. I cultivated habits that reinforced this new self: reading, reflecting, and spending time in ways that aligned with my values and desires. I allowed myself joy without guilt, rest without justification, and curiosity without boundaries imposed by fear of judgment. My relationship with my son continued to occupy my thoughts, but differently now. I cared deeply, but I no longer assumed responsibility for his choices, his feelings, or his approval. I met him with honesty and love, but I no longer compromised my dignity to maintain connection. That shift was subtle but significant. It required me to redefine what it meant to love without losing myself, to hold space for another person without giving up my own agency. I also began to reflect on the lessons of my past more intentionally, considering not only the experiences themselves, but the wisdom they had granted me. I saw how my patience, endurance, and generosity were strengths, not flaws, but I also saw how they had been misapplied when I did not protect myself. That recognition allowed me to honor both my past and my present self without judgment. I started to engage more fully with the world around me. Conversations felt richer, interactions felt lighter, and I discovered a sense of ease I had not known for decades. I was no longer constantly bracing for disappointment or searching for approval. I could participate authentically because I was grounded in myself. I noticed how this change affected the people I cared about. Relationships that were mutual and healthy deepened, while those that depended on my overextension naturally faded. I did not resist that fading. I recognized it as a natural consequence of aligning with my values. It was not loss, it was refinement. I also reflected on the way I had been taught to define success and love, and how those definitions had shaped my earlier choices. I realized that giving without boundaries and striving to please everyone had been mistaken for virtue, and that true virtue lay in honesty, integrity, and respect for oneself and others. That insight became a compass for every decision I made moving forward. I allowed myself to celebrate small victories, the quiet milestones that signaled growth and self-mastery. Waking up without dread, completing a task with satisfaction, enjoying a solitary moment of reflection, these became markers of progress. I stopped discounting them in favor of grand achievements or external validation. I began to embrace imperfection in myself and in others, understanding that life is not a series of perfectly executed moments, but a tapestry of intention, effort, and authenticity. That perspective softened my inner voice, transforming self-criticism into constructive reflection. I learned to hold space for discomfort without letting it define me, to feel sadness without letting it erode my confidence, and to engage with the world without losing sight of my own needs. That ongoing practice, repeated daily, has reshaped the way I move through life. I feel more grounded, more present, and more capable of meeting challenges with resilience and grace. I no longer allow the shadows of past disappointments to dictate my emotional landscape. Instead, I navigate with awareness, choosing responses that align with my values rather than reacting out of fear or habit. Each day, I practice this choice consciously, and it has become a form of liberation. I stand now as a woman who knows her worth, who understands that boundaries are not barriers but instruments of respect, and who carries the quiet strength of someone who has faced betrayal and emerged with integrity intact. The journey is ongoing, and I do not expect perfection. What matters is persistence, honesty, and the courage to continue claiming my life, one intentional choice at a time. Looking back on the years since my son's wedding, I realize that the deepest lessons of my life did not come from the celebrations or the achievements, but from the moments that stripped me bare and forced me to confront myself. I understand now that exclusion, disappointment, and betrayal are not just obstacles, they are mirrors showing us what we have been tolerating, what we have been overlooking, and what we truly value. In the months following the wedding, when the financial demands arrived one after another, I felt shock, hurt, and confusion. I questioned my worth and my decision, but gradually, that pain became a teacher. It showed me that love must be mutual, that generosity without respect is not noble, and that true connection cannot exist where boundaries are ignored. I began to see patterns in my past, the ways I had given too much, said yes too often, and allowed my own needs to be minimized in the name of harmony. Recognizing those patterns was painful, but it was also empowering. I began to reclaim my voice, my choices, and my life. I stopped giving from scarcity and started giving from abundance, where my heart and my energy were involved only when it felt right. I learned that saying no was not unkind, but necessary. That decision became a cornerstone of my self-respect. Each time I upheld it, I felt a little lighter, a little freer. The quiet that followed the storm of demands and expectations gave me room to breathe, reflect, and rebuild. I took the time to grieve the fantasy I had held for decades, the vision of being the mother who was cherished, included, and celebrated without conditions. Letting go of that expectation did not erase my love, it simply allowed me to love from a place of clarity rather than longing. I began to notice how my own patterns of overgiving and people-pleasing had shaped my life in subtle ways. I realized that I had often mistaken endurance for virtue and compliance for affection. That awareness changed the way I approached every interaction, every decision, every relationship. I could now discern between what was healthy and what was habitual, between what nurtured me and what drained me. That discernment became a form of liberation I had never known before. I also learned to honor my own timing, to let feelings, decisions, and reconciliation unfold at their natural pace. I stopped rushing toward resolution to ease discomfort or meet someone else's expectation. I gave myself permission to experience life as it was, without constantly editing, negotiating, or suppressing my truth. That patience brought a sense of stability and calm I had never felt before. I discovered the value of solitude, not as loneliness, but as restoration. I spent mornings reading, reflecting, and walking, noticing the subtle beauty in ordinary moments that I had previously overlooked. I learned to enjoy my own company without guilt, to explore my interests and desires unapologetically, and to find joy in choices that honored me. I realized that peace and freedom are cultivated in these daily, intentional practices rather than in dramatic gestures or sudden changes. My relationship with my son shifted gradually as well. I remained connected, but no longer at the expense of my dignity. I met him with love, tempered by honesty and boundaries, understanding that his choices were his own and that my responsibility ended with my own integrity. That understanding brought a sense of relief I had not anticipated. I no longer carried the weight of someone else's expectations as if they defined my worth. I began to trust my instincts again, noticing when something felt wrong or uncomfortable, and responding without fear of judgment. That trust became a guiding principle in every aspect of my life. I learned that resilience is not about enduring indefinitely, but about showing up, assessing, and making conscious choices that preserve your heart and your mind. I also embraced forgiveness in its truest form, not as an obligation to erase the past, but as a tool to release the hold of bitterness over my life. I forgave without needing to reconcile, without condoning, and without compromising my boundary. That act of internal release brought a profound lightness. I began to see that my worth was inherent, not contingent on anyone else's approval, gratitude, or acknowledgement. I no longer needed to earn love or respect through sacrifice. I could receive and give from a place of equilibrium. With this new perspective, I approached my daily life with intentionality, noticing the subtle ways freedom shapes thought, emotion, and action. I found satisfaction in choices that aligned with my values, pleasure in simple routines, and peace in moments of reflection. I recognized that aging is not a limitation, but an opportunity to deepen understanding and refine priorities. Each day, I practiced self-compassion, self-trust, and self-respect. I valued my energy and attention, measured my generosity with care, and allowed my voice to speak clearly and honestly in all situations. I embraced curiosity and learning, explored new interests, and allowed myself to grow in ways that felt authentic rather than performative. The culmination of these experiences is a life lived deliberately, grounded in truth, and shaped by wisdom earned through trials. I have learned that freedom is not granted, it is claimed, nurtured, and defended. It requires awareness, courage, and daily practice. I have claimed mine fully. I have learned that love, whether received or withheld, cannot diminish the strength of a woman who has found herself. I have learned that boundaries are not barriers, but instruments of clarity and respect. I have learned that happiness is not conditional on approval or compliance, but arises from alignment, choice, and integrity. At 65, I stand firmly in the woman I have become, grateful for every painful lesson, every moment of doubt, and every decision that led me here. I am aware that challenges will continue to arrive, that relationships may shift, and that life will always present uncertainty. But I no longer fear these things. I face them with steadiness, confidence, and a deep trust in my own ability to navigate whatever comes. I have discovered that true strength is quiet, consistent, and rooted in self-knowledge. It is not performative or loud, but enduring. It allows for compassion without compromise, engagement without surrender, and love without self-erasure. I carry that strength with me every day. I honor my past without being confined by it. I embrace the present with awareness, and I look toward the future with quiet anticipation. My life is no longer dictated by expectation, exclusion, or obligation. It is dictated by truth, integrity, and the conscious choice to prioritize self-respect alongside love. That is my triumph, my liberation, and my ongoing journey. I am proud of the woman I have become, and I live fully in the knowledge that claiming oneself is the greatest act of courage and the most enduring form of love. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so more people can find a little warmth and hope in these stories too.